What happens when one of music's most beloved icons sits down with daytime television's most controversial panel? You won't believe what happens when Janet Jackson faces the View hosts in what begins as a routine promotional interview, but quickly turns to television's most explosive confrontation of the year. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment. You won't want to miss this. The atmosphere in the View studio felt different the moment Janet Jackson stepped onto the set. The legendary performer, there to promote her upcoming documentary series, carried herself with the grace and poise that had defined her decades-long career. But beneath the polished exterior of daytime television, tensions were already simmering, ready to boil over into an unprecedented on-air meltdown. As Janet settled into her chair, the hosts exchanged glances viewers at home couldn't quite read. Whoopi Goldberg, at the head of the table, had that look in her eyes that longtime viewers knew signaled trouble. Joy Behar practically vibrated with energy, as if she had been waiting for this moment all morning. Sunny Host sat rigid, her legal background evident in the way she was already formulating her line of attack. Sarah Haynes tried to maintain her usual bubbly demeanor, but even she seemed to sense that the interview was about to take an unexpected turn. The opening pleasantries felt forced, almost performative. Janet spoke warmly about her upcoming projects, her voice carrying the familiar warmth that had endeared her to millions worldwide. But the hosts weren't really listening. They were waiting for the moment to strike. It wasn't about her music, her legacy, or her documentary. They had an agenda, and Janet was about to face the View's notorious political machine. "Janet," Whoopi began, her voice deceptively casual, a warning to anyone familiar with her style. "We've been talking a lot about artists and their responsibility to speak out on social issues. Your brother Michael, your family, you've all been in the spotlight for decades. Don't you think celebrities have an obligation to use their platforms more responsibly?" The question landed like a grenade. Janet's smile flickered for a fraction of a second, but she maintained her composure. "I've always believed that artists should be authentic to themselves and their beliefs," she replied carefully. "I've spoken out on issues that mattered to me throughout my career, from social justice to women's rights." Joy leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "But have you really? We've seen so many artists claim to be activists, but stay silent when it really matters. Where were you during the last election? We didn't hear much from you when democracy was literally on the line." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Janet's publicist, off camera, shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the interview they had been promised. It was supposed to focus on Janet's artistic journey, her growth, her upcoming projects. Instead, the hosts were treating her like a defendant in a courtroom of public opinion. "I prefer to let my art speak for itself," Janet said, her voice measured but with a slight edge. "I've been making music with messages for over 4 decades. Songs like Rhythm Nation, That's the Way Love Goes, Together Again. These weren't just entertainment, they were statements about unity, healing, bringing people together." Sunny Host jumped in, precise and pointed. "Unity with who exactly? Because it seems like when push came to shove, and the country faced real threats to democracy, voting rights, women's reproductive freedom, we didn't see you on the front lines. Other artists stepped up, putting their careers on the line. But you stayed quiet." The studio audience, once welcoming, now sat in uncomfortable silence. The energy shifted. Everyone present could feel it. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was an ambush. Janet's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands, once relaxed in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. "There's a difference between being performatively political and genuinely caring about issues," she said, her voice steel-like. "I don't think artists should be obligated to perform their politics for public consumption, okay? Just to satisfy others' expectations of what activism should look like. Okay." The words hit the panel like a slap. Joy's eyes widened and she barked a laugh. "Performatively political. Are you serious? We're talking about basic human rights, democracy itself, and you call it performative. Sarah Haynes, trying to steer the conversation back, was swept up in the hostility. With great platform comes great responsibility. Millions of fans look up to you, who might have voted differently if they had heard from you. Janet's voice rose. So now it's my fault how people vote. I'm supposed to tell grown adults how to think, vote, how to live. Is that what artists are supposed to do? Whoopi slammed her hand on the table, echoing like a gunshot. When fascism is knocking at the door. Yes, when women's rights are stripped away, voting rights under attack, marginalized communities targeted, then yes, people with platforms have a responsibility to speak up. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, spiraling far beyond anything the View producers had anticipated. Behind the cameras, staffers exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether to intervene or let this explosive moment unfold. The audience sat frozen, some visibly uncomfortable. Others leaning forward with the morbid fascination of watching a train wreck in real time. Janet Jackson, one of the most successful recording artists in history, a woman who had broken barriers and challenged conventions throughout her career, was being lectured about social responsibility by a panel of talk show hosts who seemed to believe they held the moral high ground simply because of their political opinions. You know what? Janet said, her voice carrying the full force of decades in the entertainment industry, decades spent navigating critics, controversies, and challenges that would have broken lesser artists. I find it interesting that you invite me here, supposedly to talk about my work, my art, my upcoming projects, and instead you ambush me with this political purity test. Is this how you treat all your guests, or just the ones who don't toe your particular political line? The question hung in the air like a challenge. From the looks on the hosts' faces, it was clear Janet had crossed a line they never expected a guest to cross. But as tense as the room already was, this confrontation was far from over. What happened next would shock everyone watching. Joy Behar's face flushed red as she leaned back, clearly taken aback by Janet's directness. Excuse me, a political purity test. We're asking you about basic human decency, about standing up for what's right. This isn't about politics. This is about morality. Morality according to who? Janet shot back, her voice gaining strength with every word. According to you. According to this panel. You sit here every day telling people what to think, how to feel, who to vote for. And if someone doesn't fall in line with your exact worldview, you attack them. That's not journalism. That's propaganda. The studio erupted in murmurs of gasps and whispers. This was unprecedented territory for The View. Guests simply didn't talk back like this. They certainly didn't accuse the hosts of being propagandists on their own show. But Janet Jackson wasn't backing down. If anything, she was just getting started. Sunny host's legal instincts kicked in as she tried to regain control. Janet, I think you're deflecting. We're not asking you to be political. We're asking why you were silent when your voice could have made a difference when kids were separated from their families at the border, when women's reproductive rights were under attack, when voting rights were being dismantled. Where were you? Where was I? Janet's voice rose, commanding the room. I was making music that brought people together. I was supporting causes I believed in privately, without making a spectacle. I was living my life according to my own values, not performing them for your approval or anyone else's. Whoopi slammed her palm on the table again, louder this time. Private support doesn't help people who are suffering. Private support doesn't change laws. Private support doesn't save democracy. Public action does. Janet fired back immediately, because from where I'm sitting, all your public support, all your daily lectures, all your moral superiority, has it really changed anything? The problems you care so deeply about are still here, aren't they? Maybe it's not that I wasn't loud enough. Maybe it's that your approach isn't as effective as you think. The words hit the panel like physical blows. These women were used to asking the tough questions, holding others accountable. They weren't used to having their own methods and motives questioned by a guest. Sarah Haynes, attempting a diplomatic approach, interjected. Janet, I think we can all agree we want the same things: quality, justice, fairness. Maybe we just have different ways of working toward those goals. But Janet wasn't interested in diplomacy. The gloves were off. Decades of frustration with the entertainment industry's political expectations poured out. Do we want the same things, Sarah? Because it seems like what you want is for celebrities to be your personal cheerleaders, validating your political positions by repeating them back to you. You don't want independent thinkers. You want performers who toe the line you approve of. Joy Behar couldn't contain herself any longer. That is so incredibly naive. Do you think politics is a game? That it doesn't affect real lives? People died because of the policies we were fighting against. People died while you were fighting against them too. Janet's voice turned icy. So maybe your fighting isn't as effective as you think. Maybe instead of attacking artists for not being political enough, you should ask why your own activism has been so unsuccessful. The studio fell into stunned silence. The audience looked shell-shocked. The hosts looked like they had been physically struck. This was supposed to be their turf, their rules, but Janet had flipped the script entirely, turning their accusations back on them and exposing what she saw as the fundamental hypocrisy of their position. When Whoopi finally spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet. So, you're saying that fighting for justice, fighting for equality, fighting for democracy is unsuccessful? You're saying that standing up for marginalized communities is pointless? I'm saying that lecturing people on television every day isn't the same as actually fighting for anything. Janet replied with devastating precision. I'm saying that attacking others for not being political enough isn't activism, it's performance. And I'm saying that maybe if you spent less time criticizing artists for their so-called silence and more time actually listening to what they're saying, you'd understand there are many ways to make a difference in this world. The confrontation had reached a boiling point no one in the studio had anticipated. What began as a routine celebrity interview had exploded into a complete breakdown of the usual power dynamics. Janet Jackson, one of the most successful and influential artists of her generation, was systematically dismantling the views moral authority live on television. But the hosts weren't ready to surrender their platform. The tension escalated further as Sunny host cut through the silence with her prosecutorial precision. You know what, Janet? I think I understand what's really happening here. You're deflecting because you know we're right. You know that when it mattered most, when your voice could have made a real difference, you chose your comfort over other people's lives. And now you're trying to make us the villains for calling you out. The accusation was personal, vicious. Even the usually unflappable Janet recoiled slightly. But instead of backing down, her demeanor shifted. The diplomatic facade she had maintained throughout the interview shattered completely. My comfort. Janet's voice was razor-sharp, cutting through the studio with surgical precision. You want to talk about comfort? Let's talk about the comfort of sitting behind this desk every day, collecting paychecks, lecturing people about morality while contributing absolutely nothing to the causes you claim to care about. At least when I make music, I create something. What do you create besides division and outrage? Joy Behar's face twisted with rage. We inform people. We educate. We fight for democracy every single day. You fight for ratings every day, Janet corrected with devastating calm. You manufacture outrage for profit. You turn every issue into a performance, every tragedy into content for your show. And then you have the audacity to lecture artists about using their platforms responsibly. Look in a mirror. The words landed like bombs. Whoopi Goldberg, whose career had been built on being unshakable, looked genuinely rattled. That is completely out of line. We've spent decades fighting for the things we believe in long before this show even existed. And what do you have to show for it? Janet leaned forward, radiating confidence. Decades of fighting, decades of lecturing, decades of moral superiorities. The problems you're so passionate about are worse than ever. Maybe the issue isn't that others aren't loud enough. Maybe the problem is that your approach doesn't actually work. Sarah Haynes, visibly uncomfortable, tried one last diplomatic appeal. Janet, I think we all want the same things. Can't we find some common ground? But Janet was done pretending. Common ground. Sarah, your colleagues just spent the last 20 minutes attacking me for not performing my politics the way they think I should. They accuse me of valuing comfort over others' lives, called me naive, irresponsible, morally deficient. And now you want common ground? That time was before you decided to ambush me. Sunny host pressed on. Nobody ambushed you. We asked legitimate questions about your responsibility as a public figure, and you turned it into an attack on us because you can't handle being held accountable. Accountable to who? Janet's voice rose, filling the studio. To you. Who made you the arbiters of social responsibility? Who gave you the authority to decide whether my contributions to society are enough? You sit here judging everyone else, but who judges you? Who holds you accountable for the damage your constant negativity and division cause? The question hung like a weapon. For once, the hosts were speechless. They were used to asking the hard questions, okay? Making others uncomfortable. But Janet had flipped the dynamic entirely. Whoopi, struggling to regain control, tried again. Janet, this is exactly the kind of divisive rhetoric that divisive. Janet interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in entertainment. You want to talk about divisive? You've spent this entire interview trying to tear me down because I don't agree with your political tactics. You accused me of being selfish, naive, irresponsible, morally deficient, and I'm divisive for defending myself. She stood abruptly, microphone still attached, her voice carrying clearly through the studio. Do you know the real problem? The real problem is that you think anyone who doesn't march lockstep with your political agenda is automatically wrong. You think loudness equals effectiveness, moral posturing equals morality. But here's the truth you can't handle. Your way isn't the only way, and your voice isn't the only voice that matters. Joy Behar was practically shouting now. So what? We should all just stay silent while democracy dies. Make pretty music while the world burns. Janet turned to face her directly, composure intact despite the chaos around her. Joy, democracy isn't dying because artists aren't political enough, Janet said, her voice calm but cutting. Democracy is dying because people like you have turned politics into theater, issues into entertainment, and real problems into content for your television show. You've made politics so toxic, so performative, so exhausting, that regular people don't want to engage with it anymore. The words seemed to stagger the hosts. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore, it was a complete rejection of everything they believed about their role, their importance, their effectiveness. Sunny Host made one last, desperate attempt. That is absolutely ridiculous. We are fighting for justice, for equality. You're fighting for relevance. Janet cut her off, her tone final. And you're losing. She reached up and removed her microphone, a small action that carried enormous weight. The studio fell silent except for the faint hum of the cameras, still rolling, capturing every second of this unprecedented meltdown. Thank you for having me on your show, Janet said, her voice eerily calm after the storm. This has been very educational. She turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the studio floor in absolute silence. Behind her, the host sat frozen, unsure whether to stop her, call for a break, or simply let her leave. Janet paused at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. You know, I came here to talk about my music, my art, my upcoming projects, things that bring people joy, unite them, and inspire them. But instead, you wanted to talk about politics, division, and anger. I think this is everything anyone needs to know about the difference between us. With that, Janet Jackson walked off the View set, leaving behind a panel of hosts who looked as if they had survived a natural disaster. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing the stunned faces of Whoopi, Joy, Sunny, and Sarah as they sat in complete silence, processing what had just happened. In the end, Janet Jackson had achieved something very few guests in The View's history ever had. She had turned the tables completely, transforming from guest to victor, from defendant to prosecutor. She had exposed what she clearly saw as the fundamental hollowness of their moral authorities, and done so with the kind of precision that comes only from decades of experience handling hostile interviews in difficult situations. The confrontation was over, but its impact would resonate far beyond the studio, leaving viewers with a clear example of what happens when manufactured outrage meets genuine authenticity. Authenticity wins.